I know you're wanting to listen to this episode of the Comics Alternative, but before we get started, let me just remind you guys that it's the gift-giving season. Now, that may be obvious, but one of the things that's not so obvious is that you can get all of your stuff and help out the podcast by going to comicsalternative.com/Amazon. Click through on our Amazon banner that you find on that page, and whatever you get during that visit to Amazon, the Comics Alternative will get a few cents kickback. So, whether it be Hanukkah, Christmas, Kwanzaa, or Festivus, get your gifts through our Amazon Associate link. It's a smart way to get your books, and you'll be helping out the podcast. And isn't that what the holiday season is all about? Helping our podcast. This is the Comics Alternative Eurocomics. Reviews of Bouncer, Western, and Lucky Luke, the Ballad of the Daltons, and other stories. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Eurocomics. I'm Derek.
And I'm Edward. And we're almost two guys with PhDs who love talking about comics.
That's right. And on the December Eurocomics episode, Edward and I are going to be discussing three titles that are all Western themed. We're going to begin with Alejandro Jodorowsky and Francois Boucq's Bouncer. After that, we're going to look at Western, written by Jean Van Ham, with art by Grzegorz Rosiński. And then we're going to wrap up with the latest volume of Lucky Luke, The Ballad of the Daltons and Other Stories. This is by René Goscinny and Maurice. But before we get into that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Eurocomics is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials will be at 45% off cover price, often at 50% off cover, but many times you're going to find some discounts that go higher than that.
That's right. Right now, Humanoids has put out an anthology called the Jodoverse, which, as Derek said, we'll be discussing Alejandro Jodorowsky's Western Bouncer today. But if you're interested in exploring the many other universes this cult filmmaker and comics writer has created, including some with Moebius, whose book we discussed last month, the Jodoverse is a great intro. It's intro to 4 different universes: the Incal, the Metabarons, the Techno Priests, and Megalex, and it's only $3.49 right now at DCB Service. That's 30% off at $3.49 for a great intro to Jodorowsky's work. Also, if you're looking for last-minute stocking stuffer for a kid, Frederick Peters and Pierre Wazem. Oh, I know we've discussed Frederick Peters several times on the Comics Alternative, but they've got a wonderful book, also from Humanoids, called Coma, the adventures, sort of steampunk adventures of a little girl in the undergrounds of a city of chimneys, and it's only $13.97 right now for the single volume omnibus of all 4 original French volumes. That's $13.97 at 30% off.
Yeah, you can't beat the prices at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your books there, European and otherwise, be sure to send them an email and tell them that Edward and Derek sent you.
Absolutely. And happy holidays and welcome to our Western show.
That's right. Yeah, we are in the latter days of December, where Christmas is just a few days away as we record this. And in fact, this episode will go up the Friday before Christmas. And we should point out before we get into our discussion of the first book, Bouncer, that this episode of the Euro comic series is a little later in the month than we have been doing. When Edward and I started this, God, it's been about almost a half a year ago now.
Yeah, absolutely.
We decided that we would do the Euro comic series, release the episodes the first or the second week of every month. But December has just been a chaotic time for both of us. I know, Edward, you not long ago, you moved to not only another house, but to another state. It's the end of the semester here for me. I've had to do some traveling this holiday season. And also we had a little problem in getting copies of all the books that we had planned to discuss. So you add up all of those conditions, and that's the reason why we're a little later in the month than we intended to be. But in the new year, 2017, we hope to get back on track by putting the Eurocomics episode up the first or second week of every month.
Yeah, if you're listening, thanks a lot for listening and staying tuned as a true believer, and we will absolutely be on top of our game once 2017 starts, which we hope will be a better year for all concerned.
Yes. Without getting too political, 2016 has basically sucked.
Yeah, I mean, not even the politics, just all the people who died.
Yeah, all the people who died. I had some family issues with my father, so it just has not been a fun year. I, for one, am happy to see January 1st right around the corner.
Yeah, amen.
Well, Edward, let's get into the December books. And we mentioned that all of the texts that we're going to be discussing for this month have a Western theme to them. And this is something that you and I had been considering even before the first episode of the Euro series went up. I know that when you and I met back in the spring of this year, and we were, coming up with this idea of the Euro comic series, and we were discussing potential shows. I think you were the one who brought up initially the possibility of doing a show devoted to Western comics, because there are quite a number of European creators who have a fascination with the American West and mythology surrounding that. So we decided that we would finally get around to that, because a couple of the books that we're going to be discussing this month have just recently come out over the past 2 or 3 months, or at least since the summer. And we're going to begin with Bouncer, which actually was released in August of this year. This is published by Humanoids, written by Jodorowsky with art by boucq. And in this volume from Humanoids, we basically, it's a rather hefty volume. We have 7 volumes of Bouncer in one edition. And I know that Humanoids has published 2 Bouncer books before this. One, which is no longer in print, is basically volumes 3 through 5, which is the middle story in the book that we're discussing. And I think that one is called The One-Armed Gunslinger, referring to Bouncer. And then I think it was last year they came out with an individual volume, Bouncer Blackhearts, which is the last story in the book that we're going to be looking at. But I don't think that Humanoids, at least that I've seen, has published the first story in this edition of Bouncer that came out earlier this year. And so I don't know what that original story is called, but basically we have 7 volumes in one edition, and this edition is made up of 3 longish stories, all revolving around Bouncer.
Yeah, this edition clocks in at just over 400 pages, and I have to say this is kind of a side note to the actual story, though it does touch on something I'm sure we'll talk about, which is the rhythms of what it feels like to read these 3 different. They're essentially 3 different stories, but 7 different volumes. And I find that I found the rhythm of the reading experience a bit strange, because they're also volumes of not entirely equal length, And so, because 3 divided by 7, so the thing is, I mean, and that's something that was rare in French books at a certain time, because they were trying to standardize the page length, but also B, I feel like reading Bouncer in this giant omnibus. These are works that appeared over a number of years, and it's kind of like mainlining or binging a Netflix series, right? Because these were designed as individual books, and like sometimes you'll get, you'll be surprised to be only a third of the way through a story and find a giant action set piece that seems to tie up a bunch of narrative threads, because you're like, wait a minute, this seems like a closing feel to what's going on, and yet. No, it's going to keep going on, and it's going to pick up some other things that were just barely planted, and then move on to a whole different like act of the story, because it's because they're within these 3 sections that this book is divided into, Humanoids doesn't demarcate the original 7 books, so you can have sort of you can get this feel for little structures that were there as in the original 7, in terms of rising action, falling action, but it's. Yeah, I don't know. I just felt like that was interesting, because like already when American comic readers like skip the individual issues for the trades, it's kind of like waiting to binge a series instead of watching it week by week, right? But this is spread out even. The time frame of most European comics is even greater. It's never a monthly issue. It's like 1 book a year, 1 or 2 books a year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You raise a really good point in terms of the rhythm of the 3 stories that are collected here. Now, this is my first exposure to Bouncer. I mean, I knew about Bouncer, but this is the first time that I've actually sit down to read the stories. Had you read any Bouncer before, or was this your first time as well?
I had read the first of the 3 arcs in Bouncer before, and I had come really close to translating not any of these Bouncers, but because there are 2 or 3 more volumes of Bouncer that Jodorowsky moved from Humanoids to do them with Glénat, and when Glénat was getting me to translate some digital comics for them, like Blood and Sand, Fabian Nuri's Blood and Sand, or the Tales from the Time of the Cobra. One of the ones that they had originally wanted me to translate were the next 2 Bouncers, but there was some kind of rights snafu there, and those were taken off the list.
Okay, so now when you read this first story in the book that we're discussing, was it in the original French, or did you read it in translation?
No, it was in the French. Yeah.
Okay.
And I've also translated some Jodorowsky for Titan, a series called Royal Blood, which is a medieval series he did with a Chinese artist.
Okay, because I'm wondering. I haven't seen an English translation of this first story of Bouncer before this, but maybe I just haven't seen it.
No, I think it must have happened, because it's credited here to at least mostly to Justin Kelly, and Justin Kelly worked
as the translator.
Yeah, for Humanoids back in the day. Like he did a lot of the original English versions of Ballad, and he did. I think he would parts of the original in Call. So like he did a lot back in the day, and I've tried to contact him before, or to get his contact info, and I've been unable to, because I would love to talk to him, because he was so active at a certain point in time, and I've wound up retranslating books that he did, but he did basically the first arc of this book, and then the next 2 are credited to a team of Quinn and Katja Donahue, and I wonder if they're related to the Humanoids editor Alex Donahue.
Yeah. So this was my first exposure to Bouncer, and as I was reading the first story within this 400-page volume that we're discussing, I thought that this is quite a substantial narrative, and basically what we have here is Bouncer's origin story. And I thought that this was quite involved until I got to the second story in this volume, the One-Armed Gunslinger, and this is made up of, I guess, originally volumes 3 through 5, so 3 different volumes of Bouncer, and so it's the longest of the 3 stories that we have in this book.
And my favorite.
Yeah, mine as well. But it is very involved. You have multiple storylines going on. And one of the things that Jodorowsky doesn't do is he doesn't stick to just one narrative thread as it relates to Bouncer. He goes back and forth or goes from one narrative track to another. And you think that the story is about to wrap up, and then something else is introduced. And I say that not as a criticism, but as, I guess, a compliment, because I was engaged with this first story, the origin story, but in the second one especially, I became hooked. And I absolutely loved the Bouncer stories here, and I think it's largely due to this middle story. And then the last one, Blackhearts, is also rather involved and complicated, but not near as much as you find in that second story.
Right, it's not quite as personal to Bouncer.
Right. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this origin story, because this is one of those, originally appearing in volumes 1 and 2. We find out about Bouncer, and for our listeners who are not familiar with Jodorowsky's Bouncer, there's a reason why he's called the one-armed gunslinger, is because he only has one arm. And we find out why he only has one arm in this first story in the volume. We also find out a lot about his family. When the story begins, we see what seems to be, let's say, a renegade troop of Confederate soldiers that are, bringing havoc to a town. We learn that the captain, I think he's a captain, isn't he?
Yeah.
Of the troop is Ralton, is actually Bouncer's brother, and this is not a spoiler because we learn this fairly early on. But Ralton and his renegades are basically paying a visit to Ralton and Bouncer's brother, Blake, and they're looking for this diamond called the Eye of Cain. And Ralton believes that Blake has it. Blake, says that he doesn't, and then Ralton basically wreaks havoc on Blake and his family. The only member of the family that gets away is Blake's son, Seth. And then Seth goes into town to try to find help. This is where he meets Bouncer, and as chance would have it, he learns that Bouncer is his uncle.
Yeah, so, you can tell from that description, it's quite a number of pages before
Right.
Bouncer actually shows up.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And Bouncer is an actual bouncer in a saloon called the Inferno, which is rather appropriate. And he works for a guy called Lord Diablo, who, at least in the first story, owns the Inferno. Although by the time we get to the second story, Lord Diablo bequeaths the Inferno to Bouncer. And in fact, you can look at this entire book, over the course of the 3 stories, as Bouncer becoming more responsible and acquiring more territory, so to speak, to guard as the stories continue.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of focus on... all 3 of these Westerns that we'll be discussing today play with a certain number of genre conventions, but Jodorowsky is pretty... it's par for Jodorowsky, but he's pretty good at throwing in characters that are maybe not from the tradition, from central casting of Westerns.
Right.
He'll toss in some that, and he also has that spaghetti influence. Even though I believe this is from these books date from the 90s, so their later work.
Of Jodorowsky's.
Of Jodorowsky's, and sort of mid-career work of boucq, but it's so a lot of his narrative habits, I think, are already pretty pronounced.
Yeah, and you're right that Jodorowsky does tap into a lot of the conventions of the Western genre.
Especially in the first story, I think.
Right.
The first story is a little more formulaic, and then in the second story, it's like he settles into Bouncer, the character, and really kind of lets loose. And there's more twists and things.
Although I think where he does let loose in this first story is with the character of Auntie Lola, who is Bouncer's mother.
Sure.
And Auntie Lola is a very unusual and unlikely female character in a Western, although I think she's an example of someone who would be more characteristic or more realistic in terms of the actual West, right? So Auntie Lola, and again, the mother of Bouncer, Ralton, and Blake, is, well, she smokes a cigar. She's extremely independent. She is a little bit of everything. She is, she owns I guess a saloon. She's a prostitute. She does what she can to get by. She uses men. I mean, she's gritty. She's gruff. In other words, she's someone that you don't want to mess with. And so this is the woman who ends up raising Bouncer and then his brothers. And so we get to see why Ralton, Blake, and Bouncer become the kind of people that they become because of her.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I made my point.
Yeah, I do think that's another frequent narrative gambit of Jodorowsky's is rooting. I mean, the flashbacks are uniformly powerful, and I think not just in the first story, but throughout. But he does root things in severely dysfunctional families. I think that's part of his personal. I think some of his memoirs just came out in English from Restless Books not so long ago, but like it's part of his personal mythos. And so these twisted families are something that pop up again and again, and they definitely torque this Western in it's hit, because I find Jodorowsky's he burns through story, he just, because he always has so much more story up his sleeve. So that's a very, pleasurable, propulsive reading experience. But at the same time, his dialogue is often really kind of just serviceable. It just kind of moves stuff along, mm-hmm. and it's occasionally crude, but these things, these characters ground the story in a lot of emotional power. It's often very twisted and very twisted, painful relationships. On
exactly.
A big scale.
Yeah. And, you were talking about twisted relationships and dysfunctional families, and we can see this even beyond this first story. In the second story in this volume, the longest of the three, to add to the contortedness of Bouncer's family is another character, a Native American called White Elk, who I think also has gone by the name before of John Williams. We find out his links to not just the mother, Auntie Lola, but also Bouncer. And I don't want to say too much here because I would be approaching spoiler territory, I guess. But he becomes an important part of the family. And again, it's a strange arrangement. But we also get more backstory on, I guess, a potential love, or not just a potential, a love interest of Bouncer's, the barmaid Naomi. She's the barmaid in the Inferno. And
yeah, I think she's a little more than a barmaid.
Yeah. Okay. Barmaid, whore, whatever we would, like to. But we find out about her background and how she came to the Inferno, in her backstory, in her relationships with, let's say, another character that's introduced in that second story, Tom, is quite contorted as well. Mm. And then we get to this third story, Blackhearts, where you're talking about strange family relationships. Evelyn and Carolyn Harton and the people surrounding them. That's weird. Yeah, to put it lightly.
Well, that's the thing, is that my experience reading Jodorowsky is often I know he was in one of the founding members of the Panic movement, right? Which means that he was trying to he's always trying to be shocking, and to have sort of to use destructive emotions to get through to moments of peace or transcendence or beauty. But my sense of reading this story, and also when I was translating Royal Blood, is that he takes this story in a direction, and you're like, no, he's not going to do that, and he does it, and then he just
talking about this third story.
No, in any of the stories, it's it's like, for example, I mean, not to spoil things, but like, what happens to Naomi and Tom, I didn't expect it, especially not so early in the story. I thought, but he just keeps going, and he keeps going. It's like he goes all in, and then he ups the ante again. And I feel like that's my sort of emotional experience of reading Jodorowsky, is that like, oh, you thought that in like I don't know, if you were used to, I don't know, American nice guy formulas, then this bad thing wouldn't happen. Oh, but it totally does, and it happens really early on, and it keeps going past that, like, yeah.
That gets back to something we were mentioning earlier about the convoluted aspect of this second story, especially. And you're right in that what happens with Naomi and Tom does happen quite early in the story, and like you, it surprised me. And so after what happens, because I just assumed getting into story 2 of this book that a main storyline, if not the main storyline, was going to be the relationship between Bouncer and Naomi, but then Naomi meets or hooks up again with Tom, which is someone from her past. And so it seems as if Bouncer is on the outs now. And so I thought that this was going to be what this second story was all about.
Right.
But then something happens with Tom and Naomi. Okay, they're no longer a part of Bouncer's life. And then I thought, okay, well, maybe this story is going to be what happens with Bouncer and, some other characters, like, for instance, White Elk. And this does develop as the story continues. But then there are other, I guess, competing stories for, like, putting your finger on what that second story is all about. And you can't really say it's about one thing. It's about many things. Yeah. But yeah, like you, I was a little surprised by what happens to Naomi early on.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely, like, if boucq, it's been remarked before, and it's definitely true, boucq did seem to study a lot of, classic Western painters. And so he does a really good job of situating these characters in a very classic Western landscape. That it is John Ford by way of spaghetti, but it's definitely more a Southwest desert scape than a plains or a mountain look. But at the same time, there, it's kind of a game for me, because I love movie westerns in American movie westerns, but I do feel like there's a substantial. I don't actually know American comics well enough to say that that westerns are a bigger genre in French comics than they are in American comics. I really can't say that, but I do know that there's a massive load, as in mother load, of French westerns from their sort of crush on American movies, and they're not very well known here, but you can go. It's a personal game of mine to kind of go through and be like, okay, this seems American, this seems American, this landscape looks American. Oh, that feels very un-American, and I feel like there are definitely a bunch of things where, like, Jodorowsky just has different boundaries. Emotional, narrative, he just have different, and he's willing to cross those boundaries. And I think most homegrown westerns did not or were not.
Yeah. No, I would say that there does seem to be, at least today, a stronger tradition, or at least much more of an interest in westerns when it comes to Franco-Belgian comics than with American, at least now. And we should point out that one book that we had considered including in this discussion is Christophe Blaine's Gus and His Gang, which came out from First Second back in 2008. But we thought we had plenty to discuss this month with the big Bouncer book and then Western and Lucky Luke. So we left that. And who knows, maybe in the future you and I can look at Blaine's Gus. But yeah, there's a lot there.
Yeah, and Gus would be a good one. It's because it's quite a counterpoint to these, in terms of tone and style to the ones mostly to the ones we'll be discussing today. Though I think it does have more to do with it it is more of a descendant of Lucky Luke than of Bouncer or the Van Ham Western.
Right.
And Jodorowsky does have Western roots. His first, in so much as he's a cult filmmaker, his first movies were kind of Westerns, right? Like El Topo was the first so-called acid Western, and The Holy Mountain was this kind of esoteric quest Western. So like, I do think Bouncer will read to Western fans like definitely something more out of the spaghetti mold than the classical mold, a revisionist Westerns.
Let me ask you this, because you not only read but obviously translate a lot of Franco-Belgian works. Why do you think that the American West is such a fascination for European creators?
Well, it's just I think
don't mean to put you on the spot.
No.
Here.
I do think I don't know. I do think a lot of genre. I think genre books were all revelatory to Americans kind of take credit for inventing the idea of genre and the formula that's endlessly repeated, and like those a lot of times I can point to like France had a crush on crime and noir too, and kept a lot of American writers of crime and noir alive, kept their work alive and in print in France, even when they were ignored or bankrupt or forgotten in the U.S. And like I feel like both crime and the West and the Western fed the European imagination a lot longer than the U.S. Like by the time they were going out of style in the U.S., the Europeans were just getting started. Like the revisionist Western was the waning days of the Western in the U.S., but that was just the launch of the spaghetti Western. The existential, bizarre. And they had mapped like sort of in a lot of the spaghetti Westerns, they'd mapped European conflicts onto it, like various political movements that you rarely find in American Westerns. I don't know. I mean, I know that in this case, in the case of Lucky Luke, for instance, and both Goscinny and Maurice did a lot of time in the U.S., and so they were just like Moebius did time in Mexico, and it was the vast landscapes were very influential to his visual imagination. Moebius's mentor, Gige, who was the first, I believe the first, if not the first, Franco-Belgian creator to do a Western comic, Jerry Spring. He spent time in the U.S. Amidst these desert landscapes. And then Moebius, even some of his early work was just straight out, flat out copying Gige and subbing in for him unnoticed in Jerry Spring when Gige couldn't handle the workload. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, it's true. And also these days, I also meet a lot of French people who are super into the beats. The French are like way more into the beats than the Americans are. Like I don't know. Like maybe the genres that we forget about have like this huge life in lingering afterlife abroad. Because
well, here's where I see the differences. Okay, now you mentioned crime or noir. I agree that in terms of Europeans, let's say Franco-Belgian comics creators especially, and definitely in French film, noir, crime, definitely important genre. But it's also an important genre in American entertainment, film, TV, comics. So I don't see there to be that much of a difference between the intensity of crime noir here in the U.S. and then overseas. And I think same thing with science fiction, right? I mean, there are a lot of science fiction works, Franco-Belgian science fiction works, and some we discussed on this series. Same thing with the U.S. But with the Western, things are different. And I'm not talking only about comics, television, definitely, film, certainly as well, that it's something, the difference between the interest in Europe, in the Western, and the current interest in the Western in the U.S., I think, there's a vast discrepancy. So there's something about the Western that, at least for the United States, it's kind of fallen out of favor as a genre to a large degree. Not completely. Every now and again, you will see a television program or a film or even a comic that you could describe as a Western in some form or another. But I think that the heyday of the Western in terms of popular entertainment is long in the past. Now, things may be cyclical, and we could see this, become a much more popular genre in the coming years. Who's to say? It's just we haven't seen much of the Western in comics in recent years. And that's one of the things that leads me to wonder, what is it about, my original question to you, what is it about the Western that really resonates with Franco-Belgian creators?
Yeah, I don't have an answer, but I do have two other side notes to that. And then one is that, I do think that American culture is a lot more obsessed with novelty and the new, and this linear idea of things go out of fashion and they're dead. And we don't look back. And I know that's changing with the internet bringing everything back all at once, and you can always find it. It's always available. Things are changing, and the nostalgia boom and all that. But nevertheless, I do think for a long time so then whatever we cast off when we didn't look at it again. But when we cast it off, countries around the world still had a lot of it. It was just because of our media, our broadcast reach. It was all over, and people just swam in it for a lot longer, and so I guess that's what I feel things that are out of fashion here can have this altered cultural afterlife across the globe. And I think the difference between in the noir genre is, sure, they're pretty much, I would say they're of roughly equal importance, but the noir always gets art housed. Often all gets art housed in France, and then it's the explicit inspiration for new wave directors and everything like that. And then with the science fiction, I think French science fiction is flat out in the shadow of American science fiction, because science fiction is that genre that does not look back, that wants that wants to stay abreast of 5 minutes ahead of abreast. I guess. And then with the Western, though, I think also that we hit a standstill when we realized that there's just a lot of inherent racism in the Western formula, and we were trying to figure out ways to move forward with that as society was moving forward, and we couldn't, and we didn't know how to for a long time. But I think, and this is going to probably offend people though, but I don't think Europe is quite as progressive with identity politics as the US, and so they're also content to keep going, to have individual artists and auteurs put personal spins on Western formulas while retaining maybe some of the racist or questionable aspects that are that are more easily overlooked by them.
Okay. And on this topic, and this is something that we'll definitely discuss when it comes to Lucky Luke later in the show. I did not note the page where this occurred, but I remember it.
In Bouncer?
In Bouncer, yes.
Yeah.
And it may have been with his second story, since we're dealing with the character of Tom. But at one point, a character, and I don't think it's Bouncer, refers to, it's either Tom or another African-American as Negro, okay? Mm. And it was at that moment, I think that was the first moment in reading this volume of Bouncer that I stopped, and it took me out of the story. In other words, I had to pause for a moment because it just didn't seem realistic. Given the grit, given the realism of everything that had happened in the Bouncer stories up until that point, to see or to read a African American being referred to in this context, in the story, as Negro, I paused for a moment and thought, I wonder if another word was used in the original and the translator chose not to translate that vulgarity, right? Obviously the N-word. So I mean, do you remember this? And I can't remember where in the story. It may be the second, but I
Yeah,
didn't
yeah,
note this.
I do know what you're talking about. I'm actually trying to look for it right now, but
But there's some place in the story where the word is used, and it just seemed that if they were trying to be true to the Western, right, to that spirit and the characters in the time, then they would have used other language that may have offended, but would have been more realistic. And so when I read that, I thought, okay, this must have been, I would assume, the translator's choice of not to translate something or to change things slightly in order to be less offensive.
Yeah, I really don't know. I mean, I do think, by and large, these translations are good. There are some weird choice. I mean, I actually have been asked. I've faced issues where especially between I think the difference between what's allowed in Britain and allowed in the U.S., or not allowed, but looked on. I think when I've been asked to tone down language and gotten into scrapes about that, but I don't know. I mean, I think that's a difficult argument to make in this case, though, because I do find there are things that are off about representations, like I don't know, like what's his name again? The sort of mock Scottish Indian killer guru from the first one, who's Bouncer's. He's the one who taught Bouncer how to fight and shoot, and he kind of comes off
White Elk.
Yeah, White Elk. Yeah, like just having this guy in the Tam O'Shanter named White Elk. It's
White Elk is okay. So maybe we're thinking about a different character here. You say in the first story?
Yeah.
Because White Elk is a central part of the second story. The one who's connected to Bouncer and his family.
Right. But when I first come across White Elk, what I think of is something weird, like, I don't know, Marlon Brando in the Missouri Breaks or something. It's like some just kind of eccentric and strange thing. But like, I just don't like, or also how the portrayal of, I guess I don't think of Bouncer as particular. I think of it as gritty, sure, but I don't think of it as particularly historical. I think there are all sorts of personal.
Okay. The Scotchman in the Tam O'Shanter, that's completely different from White Elk, because I see where you're talking about now.
All right, no, sorry, yeah, White Elk is his actual dad, or is that true?
Okay, so you went into a spoiler territory I wasn't going to go into.
Oh, okay.
That's okay. No, I don't think it gives.
No, but the Scotchman in the Tam O'Shanter is the one that gets me, and also a little bit the portrayal of the opium den Asian Chinese lady as well.
Oh, Yin Li.
Yeah, I think like, yeah, I mean, I think these are the things where, like, I don't blame Jodorowsky, because I think these are just fly by. But I also think there's sort of remnants from what it is okay to put in a Western that people are not thinking about. What Jodorowsky's thinking about is, how can I get an S&M hangwoman into the Western? And that's the thing.
Which he does in that second story. And
which he
does. I didn't see that coming.
No, which he does, and I'm fine with it, and it's a Jodorowsky touch, but that's what makes those are the things that make this ahistorical to me. It's more of like a Jodorowsky quest narrative that happens to take place in a very detailed Western setting, rather than some attempt at historical veracity, or or the climax of the first volume is also something that, like, when Ralden finally finds the diamond he's been looking for,
it's in a very special place.
It is.
And let's just say it's a place where Donald Trump would grab.
Wow, that's so appropriate.
So, yeah, I mean, there are little touches like that where Jodorowsky throws something in, and it does catch me off guard. But those are the moments I love in this story. So there's that. But there's also, and you mentioned
that's the author coming through, right?
Right. The hangman, the female hangman, or the hangwoman. Would you call him a hangwoman?
Yeah, though she calls herself by a guy's name, right?
Yeah.
So.
And so we find out that not only is she very much into S&M, but that Bouncer is a submissive. Which, I mean, that's another thing that threw me for a loop, because this guy definitely, up until that point, does not seem that he would be a sub to anyone.
Right.
But apparently, to an S&M crazed hangwoman, yes. So yeah, little things like that. Now, we were talking about representations of race and ethnicity and how certain things may seem maybe appropriate, maybe inappropriate, depending on context. And I mentioned the mentioning of the word Negro that threw me or took me out of the story momentarily.
Oh, yeah.
There's another thing in the story, and I think this was in the second one, in Bouncer, that momentarily took me out of the story as well. It has nothing to do with race and ethnicity, but this is when Bouncer is working with someone is working with Bouncer to no. Bouncer is helping someone. Maybe this is in the first story. He's maybe teaching Seth to be a gunfighter, his nephew Seth, and they're out in this arid Western terrain, and Bouncer is throwing things up in the air for, and I think, if I remember correctly, this is his nephew Seth. Maybe I'm incorrect here, but it's for whoever, to shoot. Okay, so Bouncer's teaching him how to shoot accurately. One of the things that Bouncer has and then throws up is a pineapple. Okay, the Southwest,
right,
in the middle of nowhere. And Bouncer is using a pineapple as a target. Huh?
Yeah.
That was my reaction. And I may have even made that actual sound out loud as I was reading it. Huh? I mean, did you notice that?
Yeah, no, that like, yeah, that's that was totally weird. And I even thought like the having the caged, I don't know, spotted leopard or something also later in the training was a bit of a stretch, but yeah.
But it's a wacky touch that it doesn't ruin things for me. And in fact, there's something about those weird little insertions, as unrealistic as they are, that make Bouncer even more endearing.
No, this is the thing. I got sidetracked, but the thing I was going to say about the translation is every once in a while there does seem to be things that could be I mean, this is not something. This is probably This is the kind of thing that I think people could look at books that I did and say the same of. But like, what it is I think it's a mismatch between. It's one of those times where people always ask me, oh, if you translate comics, how does the image play into the translation process? And it's a difficult question to answer. But like, this is one of those where maybe there is. You could let the image guide you a little more, because I think the question with translating Westerns is that Western has just like a book from the South would, a Western has such a specific set of recognizable dialect patterns, and you don't want to like knock the corners off everyone's speech and make it too cartoony, unless maybe you're doing something like Lucky Luke. But at the same time, that's not something French can really get. Like the French people will just seem to be saying regular French things, and then when you move it over to English, it's like, so how much do you want to Westernize it, right? And I think for example, in 232, 233, there's in the second book, there's a part where like these two lunkhead, meathead, giant blonde twins who are always hanging at the bar, and raising trouble. They're like they're one of their brothers is going to get hanged for borrowing a horse or something, and like they storm out. And there's a panel where they're like, you've got their fist raised and they're shouting and they're storming out of the saloon. And then one goes, "Let's give a lesson to this virago." And the other goes, "We got to stop this grievous judicial error." And it's just a little tone deaf, like it doesn't fit the sense of a Western. It doesn't fit the action in the panel. Like, these are not words that people would yell. I'm not talking about the periodness of debatable periodness of virago. I'm just like, grievous judicial error. Really, it. I mean, it's not heightened enough to be Deadwood, but at the same time, it's not vernacular enough to be a regular Western. And yeah. So it's things like that. It's like, okay, so like that's a very angry panel. Maybe we could find, just on a syllable level, words that are going to more convey that.
I didn't know what to make of that. I just assumed that it had something to do with their character, which is slightly comedic.
Which could be a more... Like, if that's a choice you make, you could make it more consistently, too. And
right,
then it would all make sense.
We've talked mostly about the first two stories in Bouncer. Let's talk a bit before we move on to the other books for this month. This third story, which is not as long as the second, but I have to say, of the three, this is the one that is the strangest, and because it deals with the grotesque in multiple ways. There is, and again, I don't want to give too much away here and to go into spoiler territory, but we have two sisters, Carolyn and Evelyn Harton, that in the first part of the story, it doesn't seem to be that unusual outside of the fact that these seem to be sisters that are just personality-wise diametrically opposed. But as the story unfolds and we learn more about their past, then it becomes a little more, let's say, carnivalesque. It would be a good word to use here. But we also have another character in this story, a bandit by the name of Axehead. And the reason why he's called Axehead is because he has an axe in his head. So the name is quite appropriate. The axe is buried in his skull, but it did not kill him, obviously. But he can't remove the axe head from his skull because then that would, I guess, kill him. And so the axe is there in
like
his
Trotsky,
head.
Right?
Yeah. Except it's kind of like maybe a Walking Dead Trotsky, right? Because, he got axed in the head. But he's still living, this bandit guy. And he is a bit of a grotesque character as well. I mean, the axe in and of itself is a grotesque image. But his behavior, and especially the behavior of his sons, are also quite strange. And the relationship that he has with them. This story strikes me, of the three, just the weirdest. And it's almost as if Jodorowsky had been leading up, in the previous stories to what we see in this third story, that he just kind of lets loose, and if things get wild and weird, then so be it.
I think that's true. I think we're looking at Jodorowsky getting so comfortable with the character that he can drag in his more usual sort of carnivalesque of grotesques. But also, I think it's interesting in that it allows boucq to let loose a little too, because boucq will later go on, after collaborations with noted writers like Jerome Sharon and Alejandro Jodorowsky. Boucq will later go on to make his name with a series that is very surreal. That is it's like, I just translated the first volume for Europe Comics Digital, and it's basically, the main character is an insurance salesman, a seemingly mild-mannered insurance salesman, but he has he when he navigates the urban jungle, it's literally a jungle with, there are cannibalistic smurfs, there are like sharks that swim out of the fourth dimension into his living room through the blue wallpaper. I think, boucq too is leading up to or feeling more comfortable and leading up to leaving some of the realism behind in this last one.
Mm-hmm. Even the minor characters become quite carnivalesque. There's the doctor who attends to Carolyn Harton, and then we also have, I guess, the husband of Yin Lee, who in his own way becomes a little bit of a freak. We learn as the story unfolds. But again, a minor character here. So I do think that this third story is the weirdest of the three. It's also the darkest. Yeah. And another thing that is notable about this story, I mentioned earlier the fact that in the second story, when it comes to this S&M hangman, right, the female, that makes Bouncer subservient, that, Bouncer is also quite smitten in this third story with both Carolyn Harton and Evelyn Harton, to the point that he becomes obsessed with both in a way that strikes me as submissive, like he was in this second story. And so, I mean, on the one hand, I think if we look at the three stories, the Bouncer series, Bouncer is a character who does what it takes. He's very much in charge. He knows what he's doing. He's quite effective. He may have his weak moments, and sometimes alcohol is one of his weak moments. But he's nonetheless a strong character, except when it comes to some of his relationship with women. And so I noticed in this third story, it's almost as if he's, I guess you could say, emasculated by both Carolyn and Evelyn, because his feelings for them blind him to the reality that is around him, at least momentarily. It makes him a less effective Western hero. Mm. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. I think that's a good read on that. I think. Yeah, I mean, yeah, and that's an interesting evolution as well for a character. I actually haven't read the volumes after this, so I don't know if that trend gets further explored.
Well, we've spent a lot of time talking about Bouncer because there's a little over 400 pages of narrative in this book. Definitely something to sink your teeth into. But let's move on to the second narrative that we're going to be reading for this month, another Western that goes by the name of Western. This is written by Jean Van Ham with art by Grigor Rzinski. And this has come out from Cinebook. And this is the oldest of the texts we're looking at this month. This originally was published by Cinebook in October of 2011. And one of the reasons why we're including this is because, well, it's a Western-themed show, but also we received a copy of this book at the same time that we got a copy of the latest Lucky Luke, which we'll discuss in a few moments. So we thought, why not include it in this episode for Westerns? What did you think of Van Ham and Rzinski's Western?
Well, I mean, I like the sepia tone of Rzinski's. Very, it's very restrained. I think it's watercolors, right? And then, Rzinski is also, the artist that Van Ham collaborated with on his breakout hit, because Van Ham is probably one of the most prolific and hit-making Belgian comics writers today. He came out in the late 70s with a Viking hero book with Rzinski called Thorgal, and then he's also behind the 13, that series, I think, which has been translated in the U.S., at least here and there, and then Largo Winch.
Also by Cinebook.
Right, and Largo Winch, which is also, I think, by Cinebook, but a huge... about like a millionaire playboy heir to a fortune and the various corporate skullduggeries that go around him. And so like Van Ham is a really, really, yeah, he's a major a genre script writer for Belgian Frank comics. And this is a tight little read. It's pretty mournful, I think. A lot of mischances and essentially, I don't know, like a lot of good people stuck in bad situations because of timing, I guess, I felt like. I mean...
Now you mentioned that this is a tight little read. We should mention that this is part of Cinebook's Espresso series. Because one of the things that Cinebook, and this is actually the first time we've discussed a Cinebook text on this series, and I think the first time we've discussed anything by Cinebook on the Comics Alternative as a whole.
Welcome to Cinebook. Yay.
Welcome to Cinebook. Yeah, they do great stuff. I've known about them for years, and I've primarily known them as, they're based in the UK, a publisher of translations that are much more, at least I know them through serials. So you mentioned 13. There's also Lucky Luke. There's the Blake and Mortimer books. And there are a number of these serials, Franco-Belgian serials that they put out. But the thing about the Espresso series series is, and this is how they describe it inside the book. It says, the Espresso Collection brings together stories published in 1 or 2 volumes by Cinebook. Single or double, you'll be able to swallow the best European graphic novels selected for connoisseurs. So, I just wanted to mention this series, the Espresso series in Cinebook, because you called this a tight little story. And this is a done in one. So this is not part of a series. This is it, what we're discussing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, as you said, I think that Rosinski's sepia tones, his art, the watercolor, adds a lot to it. And I also appreciate the pauses between segments of the story where we have these two-page spreads that are paintings.
Yeah, those are really beautiful, and they do add a nice narrative. You're at pause. You're absolutely
and it lets I was going to say it lets the story breathe for a bit, because you take in the first, I guess we could call it chapter, even though they don't go, the sections aren't called chapters, but I'll just call it a chapter. So we get the first chapter, and then we get a 2-page spread of watercolor, and wonderful, beautiful painting, and then we get to the next chapter, and so we get several of those beats throughout this book. So I love the art and the story. I think Van Ham's story, I'm quite taken with. I was very much with Western up until what happens at the very end, and I don't want to give anything away. But okay, so how can I approach this without giving away any spoilers for this story? It's with the act of narration, where there is a shift at the very end, and it's an understandable shift because the book begins in the first person. And the person who is telling us this story, and we don't know who this is at first, but we learn as we get into the first several pages, is a character by the name of Nathan or Nate Chisholm. And he's telling his story, but then in the final few pages, there is, for an understandable reason, a shift in the narrator. And again, I can understand why Van Ham had to do that. It just momentarily made me, I guess, step out of the story and pause by saying, okay, that's a little unusual. I mean, again, it's understandable why he's not the narrator in the last couple of pages, but it just seemed a little unusual because I was used to the first-person narration. How did you feel about that?
I guess I thought it was all right as a bittersweet coda. It's we were talking 2 pages really, right? So I guess it's funny because I read this first before I hit Bouncer, and then Bouncer's sort of insane grittiness makes this story, which is in itself already, if not gritty, at least a hard-bitten story. It's not a story that's kind to anyone, especially. And so, but it kind of like, Bouncer kind of like went so far in that direction as to make this story feel a little lighter in my memory, though I know it's not. And I know it takes a lot of familiar Western situations, but it moves with a lot of swiftness through them, so that I never felt like it was cliched because you're not lingering on them, and they're not pivotal. And I do think one of the things I like the most about this story is that it gets to this sense of mournfulness that I think was very true to the West in general. Like, people's lives just didn't tie up neatly the way they do in Hollywood Westerns, right? There's a lot of mistimed opportunities, and I feel like that's what this book is built on, is like when things could have gone right by such a small margin and they didn't, and
right.
and misunderstanding after misunderstanding, but it never feels forced, and I think that's the sign of the tight scripting. But
I would agree. I mean, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. I guess. So I like the coda for the mournful aspect rather than the.
Yeah. Now, I do think that this story is what I would call more of a typical Western than what we find in Jodorowsky. I mean, with Jodorowsky, we definitely have kind of a grotesque or surreal kind of Western, which is fine. But this is more the kind of storytelling in the genre that at least I'm more used to. So it's something that's a little more comfortable for me, and so I appreciate that. But again, get to these last couple of pages. Another thing that I wondered about, I mentioned it's this shift in narration, but it's also a shift in time because the story begins in 1868, and so we're in the last few decades, or I guess the 1860s and 1870s, throughout most of the story. But then the last 2 pages were brought to 1922. And so you're right, those last 2 pages are more of a coda to everything that came before. But what I couldn't help but wonder, and maybe I'm doing Monday morning quarterbacking here in terms of this narrative, is maybe there could have been a way for Van Ham to include an outer narrative frame. In other words, don't start with the first-person narrator, Nate Chisholm. Start with maybe a detached third person, maybe an omniscient narrator of some sort that would make sense with what happens in the last 2 pages, especially, I mean, not only given the shift in narration and point of view, but also with time. So, but he didn't. And
no, but that's a fascinating idea. That's a fascinating idea. In fact, when I'm looking at these 2 pages right now, you could almost just take the first of them and stick it right at the front of the book. And like the continuity would still be there. You wouldn't spoil any surprises. It's super weird. Like you're right. That would make it a lot more symmetrical. It would take a certain amount of narrative weight off the coda, so it doesn't seem like the coda is putting too nice a bow on on a wrap up on the nose or anything. But like the way this coda is drawn, you could just take that 1 page and move it to the front, and then leave the other page at the end.
Okay, so I'm looking right now at that first page, which is 63.
Yeah.
And that last panel, you have
a perfect segue.
Yeah, okay. Right, exactly, because we have someone. We learn that this is Sam Slade, who was a sheriff of this small town, who, if this page were put at the very beginning of this book, we wouldn't know really who this guy who's about to die in bed, who he was. But when he says to this woman, who we know of as Cattle Kate, Kate Van Deer, he says, "Do you remember Nate Chisholm, the one-armed man who pretended to be your cousin? Of course you remember him. You loved him, didn't you?" And you're right. That could be the perfect segue to the very beginning of this book. And then we get Nate's story, where he basically is telling his own story. And then if we turn the page to the final one of the book on 64, that first panel, again, we have Slade in bed. I didn't tell you the whole story back then, or Marshall Kavanaugh either. Okay, and so that would be a great way of picking up after we get Nate's story.
Yeah. No.
That is fascinating. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the main storyline here. Okay, when we're introduced to the characters in Western, as I mentioned, Nate is telling the story, and he is describing a character by the name of Ambrosius Van Deer, who is a wealthy cattle owner who is coming to Kansas, right? And he's coming there because he believes that, is it a nephew of his? Yeah, it's a nephew of his who everyone had assumed had been, if not killed, then definitely captured by Native Americans, has been discovered. And so a guy by the name of Cole Chisholm has told Van Deer that he has found his long-lost nephew, and we think that Van Deer is there to get his nephew. But then when he gets there, he attempts to kill who he thinks is his nephew. and in order to keep the fortune, right, the family fortune, and that goes wrong, and both Van Deer, it seems that he's killed, and then Cole Chisholm is killed, and then Nate, who's just a young kid at the time, he was playing along with his brother Cole. He's caught in the middle of this. Now, Van Deer brings along his daughter, a very young Kate, along with him. And so she sees what happens after everyone is killed. And so this is how the story begins. Nate Chisholm runs away. He is basically on the lam, even though he doesn't really know that he's wanted for the murder of Ambrosius Van Deer. And he's shot in the arm during this gun exchange toward the beginning. He ends up losing the arm. So this is, the second one-armed protagonist that we've discussed this month. But then his situation transpires to where he ends up in a town back in Kansas. No. It's what is it? Is it North Dakota? Where the Van Deer family is living.
No, I think it's Kansas.
Okay, so it's Kansas. Oh, that's right. It's Van Deer's brother who was killed in another state. Okay, so Nate Chisholm makes his way to another town where he becomes reacquainted with Kate, who by this point has grown into an adult, and has grown into an adult that he becomes attracted to. And he assumes the identity of the long-lost nephew, which is an identity that he, had assumed at the very beginning of the book. And so I think that is an interesting, narrative twist here, and he has to keep this secret. So, we were talking in terms of Bouncer with identity politics. Here, the entire story is based on identity, but it's a more mistaken identity than anything.
Yeah. No, I mean that the tragedy and killing that you outlined are sort of the fundamental misunderstanding for the entire story. The fundamental basis that tragedy has far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I really enjoyed Western. Now, had you known about this book before?
No. I confess, even though I'm aware of Van Ham as a figure, he's not really someone I've read a lot of, because it's not the kind of comics I gravitate toward natively. So like I'm aware that, but I was impressed by his writing here. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, and if I had to decide between the writing or the art, I'd be hard-pressed for this, because, I mean, you and I both have mentioned that Rosinski's art is just outstanding, both in terms of the watercolor and the sepia tone, and the way that he does bring this into kind of a grittiness, but it's a different kind of grittiness that we saw with boucq.
Yeah, it's and his interstitials as well that we mentioned, like the oil interstitials, generally landscapes, and yeah.
Yeah, and also the characters that are mapped out here in Western. For instance, the Sheriff Sam Slade, and he is definitely a well fleshed out character with a lot of nooks and crannies. Same thing with Kate Van Deer, or Cattle Kate. So I think this is a fun read. It's a short read. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, it'd be a great intro to Cinebooks. Cinebooks got a significant output that I think is overlooked by American readers, and if you like this, it would be a good intro, I think, to pick up more of their stuff.
Yeah. And why do you think that Cinebook is overlooked by many U.S. readers? Because it's based in the UK?
Because it's based in the UK, because most of what they do are what I would consider French heritage comics, like classic and best-selling French series, but that have zero profile in the U.S., and it's like bringing out all your favorite childhood books and telling someone else to read them, and that's very hard to access. It's like when my wife and I were in Brussels touring the Museum of BD there. It was like taking a walk through someone else's childhood nostalgia. Without the cultural context, it's like it's hard to get into other people's juvenilia. That sounds pejorative, but I don't mean it pejoratively. And Cinebook does a lot of that. So like I think there's that too, where like, and also a Cinebook is, they're kind of they're a little bit more shoestring. So they kind of have like that MBM profile where like the books don't come out maybe looking as nice as Fantagraphics or D&Q, like they're paperback, they're flimsy, but they're doing a lot of important art by a variety of artists and creators and writers, and contemporary as well as classic. So they're well worth a look. But I think those are that would, if you ask me, that would be why I think they're overlooked, because they're just bringing out tons of these titles that people have no access to or reason to want to seek out.
On the topic of Cinebook, let's turn to the third title that we're going to be discussing this month, yet another Western, and this is the latest volume of Lucky Luke put out by Cinebook. This is volume 60 in the English translation, Lucky Luke, The Ballad of the Daltons and Other Stories, and this actually came out early this month.
Yeah, so just as a caveat, I mean, this book is really only a glimpse into the universe of Lucky Luke. If you asked a Lucky Luke fan, what to rattle off the recurring figures in the mythology of Lucky Luke that you would expect to run into, this does have Lucky Luke and Jolly Jumper, his horse, and Rin Tin Can, the stupid jail dog, and the Daltons, but it's missing some other characters that I think. This is not the book's fault. I'm just saying that if you're interested in exploring the Lucky Luke, his universe is really quite large, as witnessed by the massive number of volumes that have been put out, and this is only just a kind of a quick peek into the world.
Right. Now, unless I'm mistaken, I think that Cinebook began putting out these English translations in May of 2009. With the first Lucky Luke, Billy the Kid. But don't think that if you want to introduce yourself to Lucky Luke that you have to start with the first volume or that you have to read them in sequential order.
Right.
Lucky Luke stories are such, you can jump in anywhere. So, this volume specifically that we're discussing for this month, The Ballad of the Daltons and Other Stories, it does bring in the four Dalton brothers, who are recurring characters throughout the Lucky Luke franchise. But it's not as if you have to read the earlier stories of the Daltons. Again, there's enough of what's going on with the Daltons, their relationship with Lucky Luke, that whether you start with book 60 or whether you start with, I think the first time they appear is in Lucky Luke Adventure number 3, Dalton City. But you can pick, and I've read Dalton City, you can read Dalton City and you get the same feel for Luke and the Daltons and their relationship as you do with the book that we're discussing, book 60, The Ballad of the Daltons. So it's not as if you have to prepare yourself with previous volumes of Lucky Luke. Just jump it anywhere.
Yeah, it's not a continuity-heavy series, but partly that's due to the time in which it was created. And also partly that's due because it really is for kids. I mean, it's one of the most popular French exports worldwide, hands down, and it's beloved all over the world and translated into many languages. And it's just another one of those weird things where like English just doesn't have a lot of it because things have trouble getting translated into English. But it really is its penetration in the rest of the world is quite remarkable. I'm not saying adults can't appreciate it, mind you, either, but it's primarily a kids series.
Yeah. Now, the title of this one is The Ballad of the Daltons and Other Stories, and I think that there are 3 or 4 more stories, because there's The Ballad of the Daltons, then
Blue
there's
Stallion,
and there's Ruckus. Oh, I'm sorry, Ruckus in Pancake Gulch, is that it?
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
Oh, Valley. Ruckus in Pancake Valley. And then, the third after the Dalton story, and that's the Sheriff's School.
Right.
So we have basically 4 stories in this collection, but The Ballad of the Daltons is by far the longest of the 4.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
the other thing about this is something that's true about a lot of Goscinny's work. René Goscinny, the writer for this, but the Lucky Luke universe really does branch out into it. He not only likes to play with and poke fun at Western cliches, even as he indulges them, but Goscinny also likes to bring in historical characters. He just has a historical bent, playing with even pretty obscure historical characters like Haji Ali, but then also well-known ones: Buffalo Bill, Sarah Bernhardt, Judge Roy Bean, the Clantons,
Billy the Kid,
Rutherford Hayes makes an appearance. So there's a lot of people who pop up in Lucky Luke, just the same as there are a lot of historical references and figures that pop up in Goscinny's other best-known work, the Asterix and Obelix. So that's something that is, I think, that was for a while touted as the educational component of reading these books. Or giving them to kids, was that they would get this sort of eclectic, irreverent view of history.
Right. But I think that Goscinny also brings in, along with Maurice, the artist, characters that aren't necessarily historical, or at least presented as historical figures. And by that I mean, but who are actual people. And by that I mean, as by way of example, in the Ballad of the Daltons story, and this we see him for the first time on page 15, we're introduced to a character briefly named Dr. Smith, and this is someone that the Dalton brothers are there to kill. And in fact, with the Ballad of the Daltons, the story that's being told here is, the Daltons are in prison, and they find out that an uncle of theirs, who is famous for being, a criminal, of course, has died and bequeathed them his fortune. However, in order for them to get the fortune, they have to avenge his death, or they have to avenge him being placed into prison, because that's where he died. And so, according to the lawyer, they have to kill the judge and jury who sentenced him. And this one character, Dr. Smith, was on the jury. Now, when you look at Dr. Smith, you can't help but think of W.C. Fields.
Right.
But there's no reference here specifically to W.C. Fields. Now, he has the bulbous nose, he has the top hat, he has the drinking problem.
The paunch.
Yes, W.C. Fields, in other words.
Yeah.
But there's nothing, I mean, if you didn't know that this was W.C. Fields, there's nothing in this story, like a young kid, let's say, you would not say, hey, W.C. Fields, I recognize this character.
Yeah, a lot of Goscinny is one of the most revered comics writers in the Franco-Belgian tradition, and possibly even more so because he died at a relatively young age of 51. I think of a heart attack during a regular physical exam at his doctor's office. So so his myth may have been enlarged by that fact. But people today talk of Trondheim, Louis Trondheim still being in his debt in terms of narrative pacing of jokes, rhythm, sort of rhythm of inventiveness. Because one thing that does come across in Goscinny's work is that the pages are really dense. I don't just mean because a lot of them are 12 panels, 3x4 panel grids, squares full of word balloons, but I mean, there's a lot of these in-jokes, like the one like W.C. Fields making an unannounced cameo, there are historical figures. He plays fast and loose with times and dates, but they're very dense, and the jokes come, every 2 or 3 panels, there are a lot. It does feel like it felt a little Warner Brothers to me, and also Goscinny when he spent time in the U.S. he spent it with the founders of Mad, Harvey Kurtzman, and
Will Elder,
yeah. So he there's some of that being soaked up as well. But he still remains like a giant, not only for how prolific he was, but for how many activities he was involved in. He was the founder of Pilote magazine, one of the big Franco-Belgian comics magazines, or French rather, comics magazine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also let's not forget Asterix.
Yeah, and Asterix and Obelix.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that we should probably note, because we teased it early on, is the way that certain characters are fleshed out in Lucky Luke. This is a Western, and as with almost any Western, we're dealing with a variety of different cultures, races, and ethnicities. And we were talking with Bouncer, in light of Bouncer, about the way that certain characters are represented. I think that certain caricatures and stereotypes become even more pronounced when we get to Lucky Luke.
Oh yeah, I mean Lucky Luke is it's visually it's pretty heinous in this day and age. I mean it's and not only that, the way the funny thing is that I really do kind of like this translation. I think like a lot of I'm not really familiar with Jerome Saint-Quentin's work, but I like the detail that he pays to like when there are rhyming segments, he does them in Alexandrines, 12 syllables. And he makes them rhyme, I mean, and there's a fair amount of, but like there's also a fair amount of like there's a little bit of dialect work going on with some of the racially inflected characters that's just a little bit dated, and like the Chinese characters, the Mexican characters, the black characters look just egregious. I mean, absolutely egregious. And it's the kind of thing that makes me wish, there's so much to appreciate here. Maurice's art has so much energy. He gets so much mileage out of just lining up the Daltons in height order all the time, like and there's so much to love here that I kind of wish that instead of just kind of slipping these out in more or less their original format, as Cinebook is doing, that they would give it a sort of prestige. Someone would give this a prestige re-release, the way Fantagraphics does, that would come with like a foreword and notes and something to situate this comic for readers in its in the cultural context of its origin. And give people, because I don't think you should give, this is just me, but I don't think you should give kids comics that look like this nowadays. I know generations of kids have grown up reading Lucky Luke intact, but I think we should know better than to give kids comics that look like this. In Winchlis's Pinocchio, Angoulême winning Pinocchio, which is probably one of my favorite graphic novels ever. It's egregious that like 2 panels of a Chinese person in that book look just like Lucky Luke Chinese, because that book came out in 2011.
The guy who does the laundry, Chinese laundry.
That book came out in 2011. There's no excuse. Lucky Luke, it has an excuse, but it would be even better if that excuse were laid out and explained in a way that would allow us to appreciate and forgive it. Because otherwise this book just comes out and it's like, oh, when was this book? Someone has to go online and research when it was originally came out in French and why does it look the way it does. It's some Lucky Luke is a landmark comic. Maybe it should get a landmark kind of contextualized release rather than, though I'm glad it's in English. I am glad it's in English, right. But I do think there's a lot that's really off-putting about the visuals in here. Yeah.
And, well, I kind of liken this to a lot of the old cartoons that you and I grew up watching, especially the old Warner Brother cartoons, right? Because, as well done as, the Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, Porky Pig, all those were done, the Warner Brother cartoons, there's a lot about them in terms of the racial or ethnic caricatures that for contemporary viewers can become quite offensive. And in fact, what was it, several years ago when, was it Turner Classics? I remember some cable network was doing a marathon of the old Warner Brother classics, and there were several that they refused to air because of the way that African Americans were represented. And so that, in its way, the decision to exclude those episodes, and that was quite a controversial decision, I remember at the time, is an editorial in a way, right? It's an editorial by exclusion. But still, we see, I think, in a lot of these old cartoons that we grew up watching, some of these same visual stereotypes without the context. Yeah, no, I mean, and the thing is, you can tell this is really this is a old school
unedited Lucky Luke because he still has the cigarette all the time coming out of his mouth. Whereas
he smokes a lot.
Later on, that was replaced by like a stalk of wheat because attitudes toward smoking changed. And also, let me tell you, just from being inside the trenches, sometimes when it comes to children's books and comics, nudity and smoking are two of the top reasons that certain French children's material doesn't make it over to the States.
Nudity?
Well, like if mom is topless, or if mom is smoking, wow, this is just out. And
if mom is now you have me wanting to read French,
like at a beach or something,
French kids books,
which happens less and less in France, but used to be more run of the mill. Okay. And I've seen it in books that get turned down, but that's yeah. But as you said, that's not that's. And hey, maybe in Trump's America, everyone will love reading these books just the way they are. But I really do like Morris's art. Like I like the detail work. Like I mean, we keep bringing up Warner Brothers, but it is true. It's like when there's a scene where like a runaway train smashes through the wall of a palisade fort, and like you can, as the train goes through, you can see the hole that the smokestack made above the rest of the train is going through, so that the smokestack's already long past, but this hole of the smokestack is still above the rest of the train. Like just there's and like I really enjoy almost every shot of the Daltons, like with their faces lined up, or their because the joke being that the most irascible but smartest one is the shortest, and then the dumbest is the tallest, and he's often framed so that like even his head gets cut off.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, and even the animals here. Now you mentioned Luke's horse Jolly Jumper. He talks,
yes.
and he not only talks to where we, the reader, can understand, but let's say other characters don't. He talks to Luke. Mm. And so they have a conversation every now and again. And same thing with the character Rin Tin Cup. I mean, he talks as well. And so, I mean, this is a very cartoony, and in a good way, in an entertaining way, comic.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's yeah. I mean, you're not looking for character depth or the other things that we were plot mechanics, the things we were discussing in the earlier comics. It's just a joke a minute, bright colors. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, of the four stories collected here, as we mentioned, by far the most involved is, and the longest, is the Ballad of the Daltons. But the other three, Blue Stallion, Ruckus, and Pancake Valley, and the Sheriff School, I think of those three, I enjoyed the Sheriff School the most of those last three.
What do you think that is?
Because it's just silly. And again, getting to the heart of what Lucky Luke is all about. And so basically you have a sheriff school, and you have someone training these candidates to become sheriffs because the West needs sheriffs, because they're losing a lot of sheriffs to the criminal element. But the thing about this class of sheriffs is that they're inept. And so Lucky Luke is called in to train them, and Lucky Luke is known as the man who shoots faster than his own shadow, and he is a fast shoot. So it's the comedy that goes with his training of these inept sheriffs in training, and I just thought that was charming.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I found the the other thing it reminded me of oddly was like Fess Parker as Davy Crockett, but like especially when they're pouring he's pouring out the can of peas, and how every pea has been shot through the middle, but
right.
I mean, I think the three were about the same to me. I thought the Daltons began with a lot of energy, and then by the time you get to the last few jury members, it was dragging a little for me, but then because it's the same setup or very similar one, but there's a lot of narrative economy though, in that like they the way in which Lucky Luke finds a way to spare the life of whatever juror it is and thwart the Daltons' assassination attempt is always like, it's always kind of cleverly done, and there's like events skipped in a couple conclusive panels, but you know exactly what happened, and that kind of like increases the wit because it's the economy heightens the wit. But yeah, I mean, I guess I liked Blue Stallion a little more because it felt like it was getting into the relationship between him and his horse, but it was all I think the three felt very much the same to me.
Yeah. Now, we were talking about the previous book, Van Ham and Rosinski's Western, and talking about the potential narrative frame. The thing I liked about the main story in this Lucky Luke volume, The Ballad of the Daltons, is that it does have a clear narrative frame. And basically what you have is you have a banjo player in a saloon who comes out to tell a ballad, right? So he's playing this, and the story begins with him singing, and that's when you mentioned the rhyming and the rhythm, and we get the singer at the very beginning of the story, and then we get him again at the very end. So it's a neat little framing device.
Yeah, and also there's the classic sign-off of Lucky Luke, right? The last panel is always the same, which is I'm a poor lonesome cowboy.
Cowboy, yeah. So yeah, very... very fun book if you can get past some of the, I guess, the datedness of, I guess, some of the ethnic representations.
Yeah, I don't think it's like the book that progressive indie comics fans should seek out in the state. Like if Fun Home is your holy grail, I mean, it's not the book. But like, if you're into cartooning of a certain era, and you have the historical,
and if you care about comics history.
Yeah. I mean,
you can't ignore this.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. I'm not dissing Fun Home readers. I can't lump them all together. Everyone has read Fun Home by now, so we're all in the same boat. It's more that, this is not... Yeah, I guess I just think that there are... I think I've been as hard as I want to be on this book. Mm-hmm. You could get a lot harder on it.
Right. Well, here we are, December, and it's Western month for us. We started off with Jodorowsky and Bouk's Bouncer. After that, we looked at Western by Jean Van Ham and Grzegorz Rosinski. And then we wrapped up with the latest volume of Cinebook's Lucky Luke, this one, The Ballad of the Daltons and Other Stories by Goscinny and Maurice. So this was a fun month. I'm glad that we looked at the Westerns.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. And if you want to find great books like this, then you would do well to check out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Be sure to go to dcbservice.com, and there you'll find a lot o' comics at great prices. You can't go wrong with those guys. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about our discussion of the Westerns. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message via SpeakPipe, which is really easy to use. Or you can call us on the phone. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Absolutely. And feel free to write us an email. Drop us an email at 2guys@thecomicsalternative.com, or write me an email at edward@comicsalternative.com.
Or you can email me. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And you can find us all over social media, such as on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, which is comicsalternative.com.
And to all our listeners out there, just thank you so much for tuning in this first half year, and I wish you all the safe, warm, and loving holidays. It's been a rough year, but I really hope you have everyone has some time to just hole up and do some great comics reading.
That's right. And have a great holiday season. And you, Edward, have a great holiday and a wonderful new year.
You too, Derek.
And we will talk to you guys on the other side of January 1st. Until then, I'm Derek.
I'm Edward.
See you later.
Bye.